I'm from Anchorage, Alaska. Currently I work for the Forest Service, collecting data for forest inventory project in coastal Alaska and Pacific Islands. But I'm here today to talk about my findings from a project during my master's degree. I worked on this project with this was done at University of Montana. I worked on this project with a diverse team of individuals under private funding to develop the reserve with a component for conservation and sustainable ecotourism. I'm very fortunate today to have a bunch of the members from the team here in the audience, actually. We have Fred and Lori Sinise, who are back there, they can raise their hand, and Jim Howell, and of course Linda Lyon. Jim Howell has been organizing the SED, helping to get this program here. And Linda Lyon, who's been working in Madagascar, in this area of Madagascar for the last 18 years, and this project would not have gone underway without her. So if you have any questions, you should feel free to ask any one of us after. And they're all here to show their support for Lokaro and this reserve. So this project, I also wanted to let you know that this project happened in 2008, and this was just prior to the government collapse. So now with the government collapsed, there's been now since the government has collapsed, a lot of resources have left the area, and the funding for this project has been pooled, and so we are kind of waiting in hopes that we can one day go back there and again start the development of this reserve. This project is located in southeastern Madagascar. For those of you who don't know, Madagascar is off the coast of Eastern Africa and is the fourth largest island in the world. Because of island biogeography and the climatic variation, and there is a mountain range that runs north-south, that there is 4 distinct biomes. The eastern side is very wet rainforest, and on the western side it's very arid. 80% of the flora and fauna in these biomes are endemic to the area. Because there is a spine, at the bottom of the spine, the landscape narrows and forms these littoral forests. These littoral forests go up the coast and are kind of like right on the edge of the ocean and the mountains. These littoral forests are incredibly diverse and are heavily depended on by the local fishing villages for the rich plant resources. Since these littoral forests lay on flat, very moist soils, they are heavily desired by the locals for agriculture, such as rice and manioc fields. The forest zones that aren't seasonally flooded are harvested for local house construction and burned to create grazing fields for livestock. This leaves these forests in fragmented states along the coast. These fragmented forests are seeing even more of a growing pressure for forest resources with the start of a recent mining project. This mining project has leased over 6,000 hectares of littoral landscape in southeast Madagascar, which makes up a large majority of the productive lands. So you can see outlined in black is a lot of the mining projects that have been going on. And the area of this reserve that I worked in is in the middle of the mining projects in an area that is under private ownership. So with the mining project has increased urban growth in the area and has created an increased pressure on the surrounding resources. With an expanding local population and an exponential rate of forest degradation in southeast littoral zones, the outcome for littoral forest conservation is currently a bit dismal. This leads to more unfortunate implications on the local culture that depends on the forest resources. These thoughts were also made by the local owners of a 240-hectare parcel of land 10 kilometers north of Fort Dauphin. These landowners saw an increase of harvesting on the forest, an increase of traffic and trash from tourism on the beach, and a frustration in the local communities next to the forest that sees the growing number of people on the road and driving through the road through the middle of their village. So they came up with goals of the Lokaro Reserve and brought in this team of people to help develop the Lokaro Reserve. And the goals was to build a partnership with the private owners to support ecotourism by developing a tourism interpretation facilities that would explain the local value of the natural resources and encourage scientific research on local biodiversity in hopes of doing more conservation and establishing a sustainable forest management plan with the local villages. All of these goals are intended to be bottom up and to be working with the communities to support their values on the landscape. So, and then I came in, my objectives were to kind of start this collaboration between the private owners and the village communities. And I started by learning about what plants were valued in the reserve and where these plants were located. And then I also was looking at what changes were occurring in traditional uses of the plants. But for the purposes of this presentation, I'll just be talking about the top two objectives. Prior to this project, I had IRB approval along with the approval of all the private owners in the area and the consent of the village presidents. And then before interviewing the local villages, I worked with the village presidents, along with the owners also worked with the village presidents to explain our interest in understanding the local value of the forest, to explain the importance of collaborating so that they can understand better the value of local natural resources. And let's see, my project, I used 4 main methods. One that I started off with was a participatory map making exercise within each village. There's 2 communities, one north and one south. And so I went into each community and talked with the village president, and then the village president was in charge of hosting and organizing the community together to draw a map of local resource use. And this usually happened in a central location that everybody could access, and it was in the afternoons when people were away from out in the field working, or back from the field working. Let's see, I worked with 3 healers from the 2 closest communities around the forest, and we did these walk-in-the-woods interviews. Walk-in-the-woods is an interview technique that's been described in the literature. It was really beneficial for my project because I was able to travel with healers throughout the forest in areas that they were familiar with. And this was a very in-depth interview process. It lasted about like 2.5 months, and I worked with each healer for 2 times a week between 3 and 4 hours, and we would just walk all over different areas of the forest. When they didn't know any other plants in a certain area, we walked to another area. It was very a very good process for interviewing these healers. And so during this, we collected voucher specimens of each plant and pressed them, and then had them verified through the Botanical Garden of Simbazaza in Antananarivo. So then I did rapid present absence plots that were along transects within different vegetation communities. As we were doing these walk-in-the-wood interviews, we realized that there were certain vegetation communities that were different than others, and they had said that they used certain communities for different reasons. So I thought it might be beneficial to see, are these plants that are locally used in these areas, and what percentage are use and which percentage aren't. And then I did some inquiry-guided interviews in the 2 villages on medicinal plant use. The inquiry-guided interview technique is also described in the literature. It is kind of a snowball interview process where I would go into one household and they would recommend other households that use medicinal plants. And this kind of allowed me to speak with a lot of people that use medicinal plants within their household, obviously. And then I ended up speaking to a lot of healers this way too. So I got to talk to midwives and healers that work with children's illnesses and diseases. But for the purposes of this presentation, I'm not going to talk about all the results from these interviews. I'm just going to talk about the results from the top 3 methods. So the results from the participatory maps were fairly straightforward. They were very successful for developing rapport in the communities. Organizing the communities together was tasked the village presidents, who did a pretty good job. And like I said, we met in a central location. And then it led to great discussions of which areas were most important for natural resource use. And this project is really important to building this reserve because it will help us, will respect the local areas of importance and figure out, which areas should tourists not maybe go into, or which areas should we potentially have an interpretation site. So overall, it was pretty successful. From the Walk in the Woods interviews, each healer identified approximately between 100 and 150 species of plants locally valued in the communities. Between all the healers, they formed a combined list that totaled over 205 plant species from 70 plant families. The species identified had 5 themes of uses: medicinal, spiritual, edible, construction materials for houses and boats, agricultural uses for either veterinary or just plants that were important for grazing. The medicinal uses were very diverse. They included plants that would treat certain illnesses such as hepatitis, jaundice, digestive problems, poisoning, malaria, parasitic worms, anemia, and etc. There's a bunch of more uses as well. The edible plants were generally collected as fruits, tubers, leafy greens, or spices for flavoring food. Plants used for house and boat materials were large trees, or house structure, leaves for thatching, twine from bark used to latch the house together. Plants used spiritually included either plants used in ceremonies that involved calling in or warding off spirits of an ancestor or a raza. In most cases, these plants were used to treat the spirit of the ancestor that has possessed the body of a living person involved. Generally, a traditional healer is an integral part of this, of using this plant in this spiritual practice. So when we were doing these Walk in the Woods interviews, plants were identified in 4 distinct vegetation communities. These healers had referred to these areas differently, having different importances during the interview, so I thought it might be interesting to do these presence-absence studies. Site A is an area on the coast in a series of rock outcrops that is heavily grazed. And it was chosen as a potential site for a tourist interpretation area that was on the border of the beach and at the end of this road, so we thought it would be a good place for tourists to gather. Sites B and C are approximately 10 to 20 meters higher than the rest of the forest. Site B is an area that is frequently burned for manioc fields and is now is also primarily grassland. The forbs and shrubs The forests and shrubs have been heavily browsed by cattle, and Site C has the highest diversity of trees and woody shrubs in the area because it's probably a fairly young stand of secondary growth. Site D has a thick canopy cover, yet fewer tree species than Site C. So this table describes the plant uses in the different vegetation communities, and the numbers on the left describe the percentage of plants used, and the lower axis is the use category. This table indicates Site A, the Rocky Coast area where we're going to have the interpretation site, as having a lot of local medicinal and spiritual valued plants. So it's really important that we learn that so we can then alter the plans. And then also the upper forest had a lot of construction, house construction materials, and was indicated by the healers that might be a good place to start a reforestation project. So my project has helped open the doors to collaborating with the villages. The results from my research give strength to the local reliance and importance of the plant resources across the littoral landscape. Lokaro is intended to be a bottom-up approach to designing a reserve that is continually sustaining the local need for local needs and culture. The results from these interviews and inventory will help locate areas within the landscape that should be focused on for protecting and managing. And it also helps indicate areas that might be important for interpretative sites that will include potential locations for ethnobotanical trails. And during the time working with the healers, they also discussed doing a restoration and reforestation program of locally important species. So I'm here today sharing this project with you because I feel like I owe it to the people of Lokaro area to share their dependence and value on the plant resources, and also in hopes of gaining support to preserve and restore these littoral landscapes. And unfortunately for them, because of the political environment, many aid and conservation projects that were on the brink of change have pulled out major funding. Without outside support, the local government really has limited funds to manage and protect the highly valued natural resources. We have continued to be in close contact with the local people from the area, and our team hopes to one day return to the Lokaro region and continue working in the villages on a native forest restoration and to support an ecotourism project that would help the communities of Lokaro take pride in their local culture. Thank you.